So the Bible can be a confusing book. I mean, look at it. It's huge. The stories are long. The words are small. It's a book full of rules, full of Jesus' life, full of miracles, gossip, rebellion, murder, rulers, and plagues. And sometimes, because it's so confusing, some of the books in the Bible can seem kind of boring, like Leviticus. And then we just decide not to read the boring ones. We decide that we shouldn't read it because, well, we're not going to really understand it anyways, right? Back in the day, there used to be this book called Where's Waldo? Have you ever seen one of these books before? The whole idea is that Waldo is hidden somewhere in all of these pages. In some of the pages, it's really easy to find Waldo. In other ones, though, it's a little bit more difficult. What's funny is, the more you do it, the easier it becomes to find Waldo when you open up the book the next time. Once I know where Waldo is on each page, it becomes easier and easier to find him.
Yeah. Okay.
He's right here. Well, reading the Bible can actually be the same way. Sometimes we open up our Bible and we find ourselves staring at the pages, not knowing what to do, not knowing where to look, not knowing where to go with it. When we open it up to the New Testament, sometimes it's a little bit easier. When we look at the Old Testament, it gets challenging even for me. You may not realize this, but the New Testament did not always exist. We read the Bible and we love the New Testament, the stories and the history and the life of Jesus. But when Jesus was living, he actually only used the Old Testament. He used the Old Testament to tell people about himself and tell about the things that he would do. And even when the early church was quoting the Bible, they were quoting from the Old Testament. Check this out in Luke 24. Jesus is on the road to a town called Emmaus. Is it Emmaus? You don't know? Emmaus. When two followers of Jesus are talking about what they had heard and what they had seen about Jesus dying on the cross. And they actually run into Jesus. They're talking to him, but they don't even realize that it's him. This is Jesus talking to them after he rose from the dead. And what's so amazing is that Jesus does this and talks about himself. And this is what he says. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter into glory? In other words, this was all part of God's plan. And then the next text says, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. This means that Jesus wanted to point out the whole message of the Old Testament and how it related to himself. And he used the Old Testament to do that. Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Do you remember that song that you learned in Sunday school? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And Jesus starts quoting Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus by saying, this is about the Messiah. Oh, and this one too. And then he does it with the prophets. And for the people who didn't know all of this, they saw it. It was like the message of Jesus was hidden all throughout it, just like Where's the Waldo book. And even when we read it sometimes, Jesus is actually in there, but he's hidden. Jesus is hidden in the Old Testament and he's out in the open in the New Testament. But once you see what Jesus shows these 2 followers, it changes. It gets a little bit easier to see the connections. It gets a little bit easier to suddenly realize that Genesis 3:15 says, he will crush your head and you will strike his heel. It's talking about Jesus. It's hidden, it's not always obvious, but it's there. The whole Bible tells us one big story. It doesn't tell us a story from God from a long time ago to God now. It actually tells one big story of one big God. It's pointing to Jesus. Sometimes it's prophesying and predicting what Jesus would come to do. Sometimes it's plain and clear, talking about the history and the life of Jesus. Sometimes it's letters by people who follow Jesus, and sometimes it was even letters about what Jesus would do in the future. If you're confused with the Bible, it's totally okay. We all are sometimes. Let's read it anyways and always look for Jesus. When you read something, what would change if you ask, how does this show me the love of Jesus?